Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Wiener Holocaust Library. I'm Barbara Warnock, the Senior Curator at the library, and I'm really pleased to welcome you here tonight. So we're very honoured to be hearing from Aurelia Young and hearing her talk about the life and career of her father, Oscar, and she's done a fantastic amount of research on this topic over 20 years. So we'll be hearing from her very, very shortly. Just a very brief couple of words from me. This is an event that is part of our exhibition event series for our exhibition, Fred Kormis, Sculpting the 20th Century. We've got another event coming up next Wednesday, a couple more events later on, which Monica will talk to us about at the end. So you can find out more about that online and also on our notice board just near the doorway. So Fred or Fritz Kormis was a Jewish refugee from Frankfurt who came to Britain in 1934 to escape Nazism, and like Oscar, his life had been, was very disrupted by the Nazi era, by the events of the 20th century, by the Second World War, and so on. So there's kind of affinities and parallels between their lives and also their careers as sculptors and as portrait figurative sculptors as well. So it's very great, really, for us to have Aurelia here to talk about the subject. So just a very brief couple of practical things. If you need the toilet, then they're in the basement below, and our lift, I'm really sorry to say, is out of order at the moment. And so to reach the toilets, you'll have to go along the corridor and then down the stairs to the basement. Should the fire alarm sound, there's only one way out the building, which is the way that you came in. There isn't another fire exit, so you just make your way out the front of the building. And then finally, there'll be an opportunity to look a bit at the exhibition and buy some books at the end. So Aurelia will be selling her book about her father for £15. So this is it here, lovely book, Finding Nemon. And then she also, as an extra bonus tonight, has her husband, George Young's book, his I think it's sort of rather humorous book about being an MP, the everyday life for MP, also on sale tonight. And then finally, should anyone like to buy a copy of the catalogue for the Fred Kormis exhibition, it's also on sale for £15 from library staff. So that is for the end. So just to very briefly introduce Aurelia. So Aurelia Young grew up in Oxford, running in and out of her father's studio. She has spent the last 20 years researching the life of her remarkable and enigmatic father, and has co-authored a biography of him, Finding Nemon. I might be pronouncing his name wrong, I think.
Yeah, no, it's right.
It's right. Okay, good. She is married to the politician Lord Young of Cookham, and I've mentioned we've got his book here as well. So, Aurelia, thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Barbara. So, shall I begin?
Yes.
That's all right. Well, thank you all for coming to hear me talk about the sculptor Oscar Nemon. I feel very honoured to be here in this exhibition of the wonderful works of Fred Kormis. Kormis and Nemon were both born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Kormis in 1897 and Nemon 9 years later in 1906. They were both Jewish and both came to the UK in the 1930s. But now on to Nemon. On December the 1st, 1969, Lady Churchill visited the members' lobby of the House of Commons to unveil the statue of her husband, Winston Churchill, which stands at the entrance to the chamber of the House. Pathé News was there to record the ceremony.
Through this courtyard have passed many great men. Few, however, have been greater than Sir Winston Churchill. In memory of that fine parliamentarian and wartime leader, politicians of the past and present, colleagues and friends crowded into the members' lobby to hear Mr. Speaker, Dr. Horace King, revive memories of the man whose name has become immortal and whose face and form will, from now on, be present in the Parliament he loved to serve. Lady Spencer Churchill unveiled the bronze statue of her late beloved husband. The pose is typically Churchillian, as his wife remembered so well. Of Lady Spencer Churchill, Dr. King had said, "No great man had a greater wife. This indeed was a precious partnership." Admiringly, the assembly looked at the statue, which took its place amongst those of other famous men in the Mother of Parliaments. Oscar Nemon can rightly be proud of his work, which, in its pose of determination, will serve as an inspiration for all those who pass this way.
So, who was Oscar Nemon, who could rightly be proud of his work? He was my father, and this is the story of his life. Oscar's grandfather, Leopold Adler, owned a paint factory in Osijek in eastern Croatia. Here he is with his wife Johanna in the 1920s. Eugenie, the Adler's eldest daughter, was my grandmother. When Eugenie was 18, her parents told her that a promising young chemist was coming to lunch, and she would sit next to him. After lunch, they would go for a walk, and when they came back, he would propose, and she would say yes. Eugenie did as she was told and became the wife of Mavro Neumann, an industrial chemist from Hungary, who worked for his father-in-law at the Adler factory. My father, Oscar, was the Neumann's second child. Here he is with his mother and older sister Bella in 1906. The Neumanns were part of Osijek's flourishing Jewish community. As well as his sister Bella, Oscar had a younger brother, Deze. Here are the three children, posing for the camera, the boys in their best sailor suits. Their father, Mavro Neumann, died when Oscar was 9. Oscar became interested in sculpture in his teens. This is one of his early self-portraits in relief. Everyone seems to have agreed that he was a quiet, shy boy. Oscar changed his name from the German-sounding Neumann to the more French-sounding Nemon when he was in Brussels in the 1920s. As nearly everyone called him Nemon, including my mother, I will too. When Nemon was 17, he went to the home of Robert Korski, a rich Jewish landowner who was asked to make a bust of Nada, Robert Korski's 11-year-old daughter. When Nada got bored of sitting still, she threw little pellets of clay into his bushy hair. This is Nemon's self-portrait, done about the same time as his bust of Nada. I was over the moon when I discovered that Nada Korski was still alive and living in Opatia in Croatia. I immediately jumped on an airplane and went to visit her. Nada told me how well she remembered sitting for the quiet and serious teenager, and that it felt as if he was trying to extract her whole psyche. This is Nada with a photograph of the bust done 83 years earlier. This is Nemon's bust of his beloved grandmother, Johanna Adler, who looked after him as a child when his widowed mother went out to work. When Nemon was 17, he won a scholarship to study sculpture in Vienna. One of Nemon's Viennese sitters was the Italian tenor Domenico Borghese, a very mature work for a teenage boy. Nemon was befriended by Max Hevesi, a Hungarian Jewish art dealer who lived in Vienna. When he was 18, Nemon made this relief of Hans, Max Hevesi's 4-year-old son. Max and Hans moved to London in the 1930s. Hans was sent to Dulwich College, and Max bought the Hazlitt Art Gallery in Mayfair. I caused something of a stir, Nemon wrote in his memoirs, by a bas relief I made of the Bishop of Duckovo, my first really serious portrait. I modelled him in front of the imposing cathedral in Đakovo, but he was not pleased by the results. "You've made me look like a Turk and a brute," he declared, and demanded that I should soften the harsh and heavy lines of his face, a task I found impossible to achieve. The intellectual giant in Vienna at that time was Sigmund Freud. One of Freud's disciples, Dr. Paul Fiden, was anxious to commission a sculptor of the famous psychoanalyst, but Freud consistently refused to sit for a sculptor. Fiden told the teenage Nemon that if he ever succeeded in persuading Freud to be sculpted, he would be the sculptor. Nemon left Vienna after a year and went to study at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. Nemon had a natural talent for portraiture, and to begin with, he had to take what work he could find and sculpted a large number of children. It was about this time that he changed his name from Neumann to the more French-sounding Nemon. Began to do well and rented a studio from a fellow sculptor, Pierre de Soot, whom we see here in this marvelously powerful representation. Then, with the depression of the 1920s, his commissions dried up, and as he had no money to pay for the rent of his studio, he had to move into a damp cellar. Luckily, his natural rapport with the opposite sex came to his rescue. Simone Rickers, a young Flemish woman, decided to rescue Nemon from his sad plight. Nemon then received his first royal commission to sculpt King Albert I of Belgium. The bust of King Albert turned out to be a controversial work. The Belgian Queen Elizabeth protested that Nemon had sculpted her beloved husband with his mouth open. Here are Nemon's bust of King Albert I with his son, King Leopold III, but with his mouth firmly shut. Nemon wrote in his memoirs, "I had now moved into a studio close to the royal palace, and this was the springtime of my life. I was meeting artists and poets of my own generation. My joy reached its zenith when I received a telegram from Fiden in Vienna, which said simply, 'Come at once.'" This was 1931. Nemon was 25. He hurried to Vienna to sculpt Sigmund Freud. But Freud had not, in fact, agreed to sit for a sculptor, but simply to let Nemon see him. In Nemon's memoirs, he says, "I was duly admitted into the famous consulting room of his summer residence outside Vienna. Professor Freud stood up behind his desk as I entered. I moved forward and bowed to him. Our eyes met. He said sharply, 'Dr. Fiden told me you wanted to see me. Well, you've seen me.' I knew nothing of the exchange between Freud and Fiden that had precipitated this remark, and being at that time young and filled with the indomitable pride of youth, I felt rather insulted, and on the spur of the moment, I found myself saying, 'No, sir, I have not seen you.' Luckily, Freud relented and gave Nemon many sittings. In July 1931, Sigmund Freud wrote to his friend Max Eitington, 'Someone is making a bust of me, the sculptor Oscar Nemon from Brussels. From his appearance, a Slavic Eastern Jew. Fiden, who is usually highly inept in discovering unacclaimed geniuses, forced him on me. But this time, there is something, or rather, quite a lot in it. The head, which the gaunt, goatee-bearded artist has fashioned from the dirt, is a very good and astonishingly lifelike impression of me.' After 6 months, Nemon had finished 3 busts, one carved in wood, one cast in stone, and one cast in bronze. In November 1931, Freud wrote to Prof. "Dear doctor, a few days ago, you appeared in my home with 3 busts, asking me to choose one among them to keep as a gift from the Viennese Society. The choice was not an easy one. Although the busts were made by the same hand and represent the same person, the artist gave each of them an individual charm and distinction not shown by the others and not easily relinquished. Finally, since, however, I cannot have 3 heads like Cerberus, I decided in favor of the one made in wood. With its vivacious and friendly expression, it promises to become a pleasant roommate." You can see the pleasant roommate just above Freud's head in this photograph. Freud took the wooden bust to London with him when he left Vienna in 1938, and it can now be seen in Freud's study at the Freud Museum. Freud detailed Nemon's visits in his diary. Here is his entry for the 29th of October, 1931. Nemon is mentioned just above the bottom line and below a visit from Dr. Sandor Ferenczi, who came the day before on the 28th. Dr. Sandor Ferenczi was one of Freud's closest disciples. He is seen here with Nemon in his consulting room in Budapest in 1931. And here is the finished portrait. Nemon's friend Simone married a young Englishman called David Dear. David and Simone made a studio for Nemon at their home in Belgravia, and so Nemon came to live in London in 1936. Simone gave Nemon's bust of King Albert to the Belgian embassy in Belgrave Square. In 1936, Nemon was once again in Vienna for more sittings with Freud in preparation for a statue which was going to be erected in Vienna to celebrate Freud's 80th birthday. Whilst in Vienna, Nemon wrote to his friend Simone, "I saw Freud for the 4th time today, and we spoke at length. What a great man! No one has ever moved me like him, nor convinced me of his greatness by his knowledge and penetration of mankind. This will mark my life, and I feel enriched by knowing that such a man walks the earth and deserves to have his bust cast in gold." The funds for the statue were to be raised by public subscription, but events took over, and this was not to be. Freud emigrated to England in 1938. Nemon visited him in London with their mutual friend, Princess Marie Bonaparte. Nemon sculpted Marie Bonaparte in her garden in Paris. They became good friends, and Nemon made this statuette of the princess. She told Nemon she preferred to be outside as the weather was so hot. Nemon said it reminded him of the princess who liked to pose in the nude because the studio was too hot. Princess Marie laughed and said, "That was my aunt, Princess Pauline Bonaparte." This is the well-known sculpture of Pauline Bonaparte by the Italian sculptor Canova. I took this photograph at the British Embassy in Paris, which had once been the home of Pauline Bonaparte. Like Freud, the princess was a lover of chow dogs, and she asked Nemon to sculpt her dogs, Tatoon and Topsy. Here is Tatoon looking at her static self. And here is Topsy. The Ashmolean Museum owns this work. And here is Tatoon again in bronze. She turned up in an auction in Brussels recently. In my perfect world, I would have liked the two dogs to be united, but the Ashmolean didn't have the funds to buy Tattoon, so she now lives without her daughter Topsy, but with a cat for company in the garden of a Belgian art dealer. Nemon sculpted the child analyst Melanie Klein in London in 1939. In the film you're about to see, Nemon is talking to Melanie Klein in her garden in Maid Vale. I think the film must have been made for Nemon, as she'd been asked to pose in different positions. In a minute, you'll see them talking to each other. I'd love to know if they're talking in English or German. So I don't know when we see their... Any lip readers here? Okay, probably done, Melanie Klein. Apparently, Melanie Klein disliked the bust of Nemon, the bust Nemon made of her, and she destroyed it. When told about this vandalism 40 years later, Nemon said, "My impression was that Melanie had a noticeable tendency to pomposity and was easily capable of self-righteous behavior. Maybe these qualities were manifest in my work and caused her some discomfort." Just before the war broke out, Nemon went back to Yugoslavia. Here he is with his mother and younger brother Desi. He never saw them again. They and his 80-year-old grandmother were captured and murdered by Nazi sympathizers. Eugenie and Desi were both shot in the Banica concentration camp. This was a notoriously cruel concentration camp in Serbia. 90% of the Jewish community of Osijek were murdered in the Holocaust. Here is Nemon with his beloved grandmother. And here he says goodbye to her, little knowing he will never see her again. Nemon is kneeling by the grave of his grandfather, Leopold Adler, in the Jewish cemetery in Osijek. The gravestone now has the added names of the members of the Adler family who perished in the Holocaust. Nemon's mother, brother, grandmother, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Nemon was deeply affected by the death of his family, and 20 years after the war ended, he went back to Osijek, the unveiling of his Holocaust memorial. He called this sculpture Humanity, and it represented to him his hope for the future. A mother is looking lovingly into the eyes of her baby, passing on humanity with the love she has for her child. Nemon's sister, Bella, survived the Holocaust thanks to a kind non-Jewish doctor in Osijek who arranged for Jewish medical staff to help with an outbreak of syphilis in Bosnia. The Jewish medical staff were relatively safe in Bosnia, and the local people liked them. Bella is on the left in the picture with Nemon and their mother. Nemon took over a studio in Kinnerton Street in Belgravia from the French artist Paul Mars, who decided to move to Steep in Hampshire. Nemon often went to the nearby Allies Club for lunch. However, the smart Polish counts objected to the scruffy sculptor with clay under his fingernails and tried to get him barred. The club's president, Sylvia Henley, Clementine Churchill's cousin, overruled them, arguing that as a refugee from the Nazis, He was exactly the sort of person the club should welcome. We'll leave the war for a while and look at the early life of Nemon's future wife, my mother, Patricia. Patricia was the only child of Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Villa-Stewart and his wife, Constance, prosperous Norfolk landowners. Here is Patricia with her parents and grandmother when she was 5 in 1915. And here she is with her mother, aged 8 in 1918. When Patricia was 26, she was sent for analysis to Dr. Ernest Jones, Sigmund Freud's London-based disciple. This half-bust of Ernest Jones lives in a cupboard at the Institute of Psychoanalysis in Maida Vale. On the face of it, they were an unlikely match. She was an English debutante and heiress to an estate in Norfolk, whilst he was a penniless refugee who spoke very little English. Patricia fell in love with the charismatic and intelligent sculptor. Patricia's parents were horrified, and Colonel Villa-Stewart asked his solicitor, Farris, if there was any way in which Nemon could be banned from the country. Farris wrote to the Home Office. We have been approached by our client, Colonel Patrick Villa-Stewart, in the following circumstances. Captain Villa-Stewart has one daughter who will ultimately inherit the family property, which is of considerable value. She's a young lady of artistic temperament who has contracted an acquaintance with one Oscar Nemon, a Yugoslavian Jewish artist. The Home Office failed to take the matter further, as the police report stated that Miss Villa-Stewart had not complained about Nemon. But Patricia's parents were still not happy. So once the war was declared in 1939, they told the Home Office that Nemon was a spy for the SS. The Home Office then ordered Nemon to leave the country by January 1940. Instead of obeying this draconian order, Nemon left London and slipped away into the countryside and stayed in a hotel in the village of Abinger Common in Surrey. This is a letter Nemon wrote to his mother from the hotel. While staying at the Abinger Hatch Hotel, Nemon made friends with a beautiful young woman called Violette Cunnington. Violette was the mistress of the film star Leslie Howard, who lived nearby. Violette was an aspiring young actress. Here she is with Leslie Howard in the film Pimpernel Smith. Violette introduced Nemon to Leslie Howard. They're in Nemon's London studio with the bust Nemon made of the famous actor. In the autumn of 1942, Violette became seriously ill and died of pneumonia when she was only 32. 2 months after her death, the heartbroken Leslie Howard wrote to Nemon. Dear Mr. Nemon, I don't know if you've heard the sad news that my beloved Violette had passed away 3 months ago. I'm now trying to find all the photos and other records of her. And I remember you made a little bust of her, or I think you did. Could you let me know if you have it and when I could see it? I'm searching for anything which will give me an impression of her. Perhaps you could do something from memory, knowing her lovely personality. Yours sincerely, Leslie Howard. Sadly, Leslie Howard was killed in a plane crash not long after he wrote this letter, and the bust Nemon made of him has disappeared. Whilst hiding in the village of Abinger, Nemon was taught English by a 60-year-old American Jewish lady who'd been an actress in her youth. Called Florence Kahn. Florence spoke French to Nemon, but her husband decided that she and Nemon were having much too much fun together and took over the English lessons. Nemon's new teacher turned out to be the novelist and caricaturist Max Eban, who Nemon described as almost a stage version of a retired colonel. I was not keen to learn English as a form of drill on a parade ground. Max Eban made this sketch of Nemon in 1939. Eventually, the Home Office seems to have lost interest in Nemon, and he moved to Oxford. Patricia continued to defy her parents. They spoke to each other in French and made their home in Oxford. Here they are on the steps of the Ashmolean Museum. For this act of rebellion, my mother's allowance was reduced to a frugal minimum by her wealthy parents, and Nemon was never invited to visit Patricia's Norfolk home. My brother was born in Oxford in 1941. Here he is posing for his first bust. I came next, and then our sister, Falcon, Aurelia. Where are you, Aurelia? Aurelia and Electra. I was, who I'm glad to say is with us today. Hello, sister. I was named not after Julius Caesar's mother, who was also Aurelia, but after a Pullman railway carriage. Nemon held many exhibitions in London in the 1940s. Queen Marie of Yugoslavia is looking at the impressive bust of her son, the young King Peter of Yugoslavia, then in his early 20s. Nemon liked working in double life size, but sadly, this was impractical during the war, as few people could afford to have the bust cast in bronze. Max Eban introduced Nemon to Hermann Fiedler, a German professor at Oxford. Professor Fiedler sometimes invited Nemon to musical evenings he held in his Oxford home, and it was there that Nemon met the pianist and chemist, Professor Ernst Chain. Here he is with the singer Ralph Cohn. In 1944, Patricia became seriously ill with both pleurisy and double pneumonia. When the doctors told Nemon there was no hope for her, he was in despair. What would he do with two small children in a foreign country in the middle of a war? Luckily for us, Professor Chain had recently helped develop penicillin. He gave Patricia an early dose of this wonder drug, and it saved her life. This is Dr. Daniel Chain, Ernst Chain's son, with Nemon's bust of his father, which can be seen in the Ernst Chain building at Imperial College. As there was no money to buy a house, we lived in two redundant asbestos army huts on Bulls Hill, just outside Oxford. We lived in one hut, and Nemon used the other one as his studio. We three children, seen in front of the studio wing, were sent to school in Oxford. Nemon often made a small head of his subject out of plasticine. This head was very transportable and meant he could have sittings with people in their own homes. He's working on the plasticine head of the Israeli diplomat, Abba Eban. This bust can be seen in the Foreign Ministry in Jerusalem, Here I am with the bust when I visited Israel in 2009. This is Nemon's bust of the Belgian Prime Minister Paul-Henri Spaak, who was in England during the war. This bust now stands in the European Parliament in Brussels. Nemon's friend Simone became Spaak's mistress in the 1940s and eventually married him. Simone and Spaak came to visit us on Boars Hill. Simone has her arm around me and my mother is holding Electra. In 1950, René Laforge, a French psychoanalyst, invited Nemon to stay in Marrakesh at La Marmounier, the same hotel as Winston Churchill and his family. This vibrant painting of Marrakesh is by Winston Churchill. Nemon made a sketch of Churchill by observing him in the dining room. Sylvia Henley, Clementine Churchill's cousin and Nemon's saviour at the Allies Club, joined the Churchill party after a week and asked Nemon if he had sculpted the Prime Minister. Nemon told her that he had in fact made a small bust of Churchill. Sylvia Henley was so excited when she saw the head, she immediately took it to show her cousin Clementine. A few hours later, Nemon received a letter from Clementine Churchill asking if she could buy the bust. As she said, "Your bust represents to me my husband as I see him, and I would like to have it just as it is. It would be a great joy for me to possess it." Her request must have been granted. My dear Monsieur Nemon, had no time before leaving for Tanger to reply to your letter. It is indeed kind of you to wish to give me that beautiful little bust of my husband. I shall always treasure it. Yours sincerely, Clementine Churchill. The young Queen commissioned Nemon to make a marble bust of Churchill for Windsor Castle. Churchill insisted on choosing Nemon as the artist, although he didn't have the necessary qualification of membership of the Royal Academy, and the Royal Academy refused to show the bust in their next summer exhibition. This is the bust that now stands in the royal apartments at Windsor Castle. In 1955, the City of London commissioned Nemon to make a statue of Churchill for the Guildhall. Churchill unveiled the statue just a few months after he'd stood down, as Prime Minister.
Very rarely does the City of London honour a man by unveiling a public statue to him in his lifetime. But Sir Winston Churchill is no ordinary man, and it's a great occasion when the corporation and their guests gather in the Guildhall for the Lord Mayor's welcome. Lord Mayor Sir Harold Howard pulls the cord and reveals sculptor Oscar Nemon's work, commissioned by the corporation in view of Sir Winston's outstanding services to this country and to the world at large. Sir Winston says,
"My lord, ladies and gentlemen, I regard it as a very high honor that the City of London should decide to set up a statue of me in this famous Guildhall, which I have so often visited and spoken in during the last 50 years or more. I also admire, if I may say so, this particular example which you, my Lord Mayor, have just unveiled, because it seems to be such a very good likeness."
a worthy addition to the Guildhall's many historic treasures.
The 1950s and 60s were Nemon's golden period when he sculpted the Queen for Christ Church, Oxford. In the Tate Gallery archives, I found a description by Sir John Rothenstein of the day when Nemon failed to turn up for his sitting with the Queen. Here is Sir John Rothenstein, a former director of the Tate Gallery, at the unveiling of his bust in 1982. Sir Martin Chartres is standing in the middle of the group. Sir John wrote, "When the Queen inquired at the time arranged where Nemon was, Sir Martin Chartres said, 'I'm afraid, ma'am, that he isn't here.' When told what had occurred, the Queen laughed, saying such a thing had never happened before. Chartres then telephoned to ask why he had not arrived. Nemon explained that he was in bed with a migraine. 'If that is your only excuse, it is impertinent.' Distressed, Nemon apologized. Chartres put down the telephone, but rang up shortly afterwards, and a sitting was arranged for the afternoon. The Queen was amiability itself and nicknamed Nemon the missing Oscar. In the 1960s, Nemon was commissioned to make a bust of the Queen for the new QE2 cruise liner. When the Queen visited the QE2 in 1969, she said, "I have now sat 7 times with this bust, and each time he finds something wrong with it. That's no good," he says, and wrings my head off. In 2009, one of Nemon's 1950s busts of the Queen was unveiled in the House of Lords. The veiled bust is on the left, waiting to be unveiled by the Queen herself. This bust can now be seen in the robing room in the House of Lords. This is Nemon's sketch. No, this is Churchill's sketch of Nemon, which he made when he decided to try his own hand at sculpture. Churchill went on to make a bust of Nemon, his only work of sculpture, which is on display in Churchill's studio at Chartwell. In a moment, you will hear Nemon's soft voice telling an interviewer how Churchill came to make the sculpture.
One day, he decided that he will do my sculpture in order that I could see his in exchange.
So he actually did a bit of the work?
Yes, the only sculpture he ever did was my head.
Good heavens. Where is this sculpture?
But that's in his in Chartwell now, in his museum, shall we say, among his pictures.
Was it a good head?
Well, it was certainly good for. He did that sculpture at 2:00 in the morning, but he was very excited while he was working on it. His cigar was melting in his mouth of excitement. It isn't plaster, but then he allowed me to cast a replica in bronze for my own vanity, he said.
In 1965, Manny Shinwell, a Jewish member of parliament, was the chairman of a committee which was set up to find a suitable way to erect a memorial to Sir Winston Churchill in the House of Commons. The committee decided to commission Nemon to make a statue of Churchill to be placed on the vacant plinth by the Churchill Arch at the entrance to the chamber of the House of Commons. Nemon's bust of Lord Shinwell can be seen in the House of Commons. The Churchill Arch is so named because Churchill stood there in May 1941 and saw the chamber of the House of Commons in ruins after it had been bombed in the war. The then Minister of Information advised that no publicity should be given to the disaster. Churchill replied, "Publish it to the world and leave that arch to remind those who come after how they kept the bridge in the brave days of old." Nemon depicted Churchill striding through the rubble of war-torn London. At the ceremony, Nemon said, "I was trying to express an idea of impatience and hurry of a man wanting to see something done." MPs touched Churchill's toe for luck before making important speeches. Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery was initially rather brusque. "How long will it take you to finish this sculpture?" he demanded. Nemon was unable to answer, saying it depended how difficult it was going to be. "How many sittings did the Queen give you?" 10, he answered, although in fact she'd given him 7. "What a waste of time," replied the Field Marshal. "But I'll give you 10 sittings too." This statue of Montgomery stands in Whitehall near the Cenotaph. Nemon preferred working on his beautiful reliefs. He loved classical music, and I grew up hearing Beethoven's Spring Sonata and Mendelssohn's Elijah coming from the studio. Nemon was a very protective father, but luckily for me, he gave his blessing to my marriage to George Young in Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford. Here are the young couple cutting the cake in front of Nemon's bust of the Queen at the wedding reception in Christ Church Hall. Nemon crossed the Atlantic to sculpt President Eisenhower, and in a letter to Nemon, the president wrote, "You were most patient with me during the weeks you were in Gettysburg. I'm grateful for this and the fine work you completed." The Queen granted Nemon a studio to work in St. James's Palace. This studio opened on to the Queen Mother's garden. She would often pop in to see how work was progressing and give racing tips over a glass of whiskey. Nemon sculpted the eminent child analyst, Dr. Donald Winnicott, in the late 1960s. Dr. Winnicott decided that as the statue of Freud was not going to be placed in Vienna as originally intended, he would help raise the money to erect Nemon's statue near Freud's London home. Here you see Anna Freud talking at the unveiling of her father's statue at its original site in Swiss Cottage in 1970. The statue was later removed and placed at its present site at the junction of Fitzjohn's Avenue and Belsize Lane. 1979 saw the ushering in of a new Conservative government, and Nemon was commissioned to sculpt the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. During the gestation period of this important work, my husband George, then a junior minister, was having tea with his friends in the members' room when Margaret Thatcher joined the group. During a lull in the conversation, George leant forward and said, "Margaret, how is your bust coming along?" There was a shocked gasp from George's colleagues, and he was sacked in the next reshuffle. The Queen invited Nemon and Patricia to a banquet at Buckingham Palace. Patricia is wearing her tiara, last worn when she went to Buckingham Palace as a debutante. Nemon was commissioned to make a relief of Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1984. He had one very enjoyable sitting with the princess and made a sketch of the princess, but died of a heart attack in hospital just before his second sitting. Diana wrote me a generous letter of condolence. This is the last page. "I was greatly looking forward to my next sitting with your father, and now I will remember that happy hour I was fortunate enough to spend with him. Yours sincerely, Diana." This is the obituary that appeared in the Times, sculptor of the nation's leaders. Borken's son, Nemon's little grandson, is sweeping the studio shortly after Nemon's death. Nemon was an enigma even to his own family and remained throughout his life something of an outsider. Nemon is talking to Albie Rosenthal, one of his oldest friends. They're looking at Nemon's bust of John Christie, the founder of the Glyndebourne Opera House. I'll read a short excerpt from the moving address Albie gave at Nemon's funeral. The capturing, the revealing of the essential was the mainspring of his art. His was not the facile reproducing of external features. What mattered to him was to find the complex nature of the anima of his sitters, the secrets of their inner selves and intimations of their destinies, and then to make the inner image, as it were, shape the visible outlines of the portrait. When President Obama visited the House of Commons in 2011, he was escorted past Nemon's statue of Churchill and was allowed to touch Churchill's toe. One of Nemon's greatest regrets was that the statue of Freud was never erected in Vienna, as it was intended to be in 1936. Luckily, Nemon kept the plaster cast of the Hampstead statue so that another bronze cast could be made. In 2018, the Medical University of Vienna, where Freud studied as a medical student, decided to raise the money to have another statue cast in bronze. The statue was unveiled by Freud's great-grandson, Lord David Freud, seen on the right with his cousin, Matthew Freud. David Freud ended his speech with, "Welcome home, great-grandfather." The old army huts on Bulls Hill were replaced by a new studio in the 1970s. Falcon's widow, Alice, has created a wonderful Oscar Nemon Museum and Archive Center, which she sometimes opens to the public. Visitors are able to see Nemon's Holocaust memorial statue, Humanity, which has recently been placed outside the studio. Details can be found on the Oscar Nemon website. A few years ago, one of my mother's oldest friends wrote to me, "I hope when you write a book about Nemon, you will not forget the magical, hypnotic, exotic quality your father had, a powerful passion, not obvious under normal acquaintance, but perhaps the secret of his exceptional talent." Julian Hale and I have tried to do Nemon justice in our book, Finding Nemon. And so now I've come to the end of my talk. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Aurelia. That was really fascinating and very enjoyable. So we've got a bit of time for, oh, I'm not in the shop. We've got a bit of time for questions. So just to say to the audience that you need to speak into the microphone I'll bring round, because otherwise the online audience won't hear you. Yes, so any questions from the audience?
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I understand that Nemon was also engaged in a conversation with another sculptor of Yugoslavian origin called Ivan Meštrović, who encouraged him to come from Paris to the UK. I wondered if you knew anything more about that relation, or indeed his connection with sculpture in Yugoslavia at the time.
I don't, thank you for your question. I don't know very much about Meštrović, who was quite a bit older than Nemon, except that apparently Meštrović said, "Go to Paris," but Nemon went to Brussels because it was a little bit nearer his home and his widowed mother. So yes, so more than knowing that Meštrović said, "Go to Paris," they obviously knew each other in some sort of way. Sorry, I can't really tell you more, except we seem to have got a bust, one of Meštrović's bust of an unknown woman in the studio. So must have given the bust.
Thank you, Aurelia. That was fascinating as always. I've been to quite a few of your talks.
Thank you. Nice.
It's always a pleasure, and there's always something new. And there's a lot new in this talk, is there not? But my question really is, what happened? Do we know what happened to the small head that he made of Churchill, that original head that was gifted him?
No, the head that Lady Churchill, Clementine Churchill, said, "I will treasure and keep," doesn't seem to have been treasured or kept. I don't know. No, when I went round Chartwell, I was looking to see if there was this little head. No, I don't know, but Nemon did make a little head of Churchill, but where nobody seems to know where that one is. Sorry.
Question here.
Hello, good evening. I very much enjoyed your talk, and it seems you've done a lot of research. I was wondering, how much did you have to find out after your father died? And then I'm also interested in the relationship between your father and the town he came from, and whether he's claimed in any way by
Ossia.
Yes, or the Croatian artistic institutions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I didn't know anything much about my father. I mean, he was a very loving father, and I grew up with him. But you know, children aren't really very interested in their parents very often. So I didn't know much about it. Now, he didn't keep, because he was in Vienna and then everything was lost. In Vienna, in Brussels, everything was lost. So he didn't keep any records, but he did keep lots of letters and lots of photographs. So he did keep lots of things, although he didn't keep proper records. So we've got to have wonderful photographs of busts that he made in Brussels with no name. And we also have exhibition catalogues from Brussels with lots of names, but I can't find what they looked like. So it's very frustrating. So luckily he kept lots of, like the letter from Leslie Howard. And you know, that he did keep lots of odds and ends, luckily, which helped me put things together. And also, very luckily, because he sculpted sort of lots of famous people, they kept his letters. So in the Bodleian, all his letters to Lady Violet Bonham-Carter, who loved him, and lots of other people are there. In the library, the Royal Library in Brussels there, Simone, because she married the Belgian Prime Minister in the end, kept everything, kept all Nemon's letters. So all his love letters, Simone, are in Brussels. In the Library of Congress in Washington, there are lots of things. So I've been able to piece things together because so many people kept things and put them in, you know, libraries and museums. So there's lots of work that still turn up. There lots of things still keep turning up. Of course, and what's more fun about that is because he was a portrait sculptor, the things that turn up are people, and people, then there's always a story. Sadly, the bust of Ferenczi is lost, you know, in Budapest, but lots of them are lost. And the busts, after Leslie Howard died, Nemon had a letter from a solicitor saying, we are coming to collect the busts of Leslie Howard and Violet. You are not allowed to reproduce them or photograph them. And they've disappeared. And the Howard family are very touchy about it because of Violet being the mistress. So they're...
Okay, thank you. We've got one.
Shall I just answer the question about
yeah.
Are they interested? Well, there's a young man a young art historian, I suppose getting a bit older than a young man, who is in Ossia, who is very interested. Ossia has become, this is Nemon's hometown, very interested. Croatia's not terribly, there's somebody split in Croatia who's interested, but he's not really quite fated, and probably because he hasn't got a very Croatian name. I'm not quite sure about him. But Ossia is becoming more interested. So.
Thank you. We've got a few questions online.
Yes, we have Gillian asking, after all Nemon's fine and prestigious work and care for your mother, did your maternal grandparents ever become reconciled to the marriage?
I'm afraid not, no. My grandmother was the one who was most offended. No, I'm afraid they didn't. That's the best I can say, they didn't.
And another question from Stephen Davis. He says he finds it so interesting that he did that sculpture Humanity, which seems to reflect a sense of hope. In many conversations with him in 1975 and 76, Stephen found Oscar Nemon very pessimistic about the world. So he's asking, how did you see him in that sense? How did you see your father in that sense regarding pessimism or hope in humanity?
Oh, I see. Well, it must be very difficult if your mother is killed and your brother is killed and all your families to have much hope in humanity. But I was married very young, so I sort of left home quite early. So I didn't, have, and as a child, you're not particularly interested. I mean, he didn't seem particularly pessimistic to me, but it must have been pretty awful. So sorry, Stephen, not to give you a better answer.
And one last practical question. We have Leah Esley asking if it's possible to visit the studio.
If who visited?
If it's possible to visit your father's studio.
Is it possible? My sister-in-law Alice made this wonderful studio. She's has opened it in the past, and she may open it in the future, but it's just a matter of getting in touch with her to see. I think at the moment it's not open, but she sometimes opens it. But I think maybe not this year, but I think on the website there's a way of getting in touch with Alice, and then she'll tell you.
So if people just Google Oscar Nemon, they'll get the website.
Find it, yes.
Yeah, and Boars Hill.
Easily, you'll find.
Okay.
Yeah, you'll find.
Great. So we've got time for a couple more questions. So I can see there's two ladies here. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Aurelia, that was wonderful, really interesting and enlivening. There was a wonderful series of 3 episodes by Simon Sharma talking about how artists tend to foresee and to highlight what is going on politically. And it was on the television, very, very good. But I wondered, did you feel that your father was political, or was he simply successful within his circumstances?
Well, he certainly admired Churchill. And so I would say, yes, he was actually, he had very strong views about nearly everything. And women loved him because although when they were sitting for him, he was a bit like a psychoanalyst. That's why my grandparents were so wary, because they thought he was a psychoanalyst. So whereas analysts would listen, and Nemon would say, your husband's no good to listen to him. So he was he had his very strong opinions, so he was fairly political, but I wouldn't say he was left-wing. So, yeah.
Oh, you've got, yeah.
Thank you very much. Just wondering, you've seen so many of his sculptures. Is there one in particular that you love, or some of them, and what attracts you to them?
I think humanity certainly was Nemon's. He told his neighbor it was his favorite work. I'm very fond of the bust, well, you've probably forgotten it, of my brother when he was about 2, when I said Falcon Aurelia. That's such a lovely bust. That's one of my favorite, and I'm lucky enough to have it. So, yeah. What about the relief? You can't talk. Oh. Sister, speak. Only speak when you're allowed.
I always felt that when he was making his reliefs, those early reliefs of the human figures, of female figures, yeah. I thought those represented a huge amount of emotion and yeah. feeling, and those early works that he did, the coins he did yes. when he was young.
I just haven't shown any coins.
Yeah,
where we go.
There's a
Yes.
And he somehow seemed to be able to express himself very well.
Yeah.
with
He
the-
would have
with
liked.
the
He didn't
reliefs.
really want to be a portrait sculptor. He really wanted to be whatever another word is.
Well,
Creative sculptor. But he had to earn money. And never earned much money, and that's why we lived in a shed. Yeah.
I've been convinced to allow one more short question.
A very tiny question. Thank you so much for the most marvelous presentation and lecture. Just to ask you whether you called Nemon Nemon or father or dad. What did you call him?
Papa.
Papa.
Mama and Papa.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Not Papa or Mama, but Papa and Mama.
Okay, thank you all very much, and thank you to Aurelia for fantastic talk and answering all your questions. I'm just going to hand over now to Monica Bone-Duchesne, who is the co-organizer of this event, and in fact invited Aurelia, and she's just going to briefly talk about the project of which this event is part.
Thank you, Barbara. Maybe I'll stand up. Good. Yes, I don't want to talk too much about the project, except to say that it's one that I started some years ago now with the intent of paying tribute precisely to creative figures like Aurelia's father, Oscar Nemon. In other words, the refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe and their tremendous, long, wide-ranging and pervasive contribution to British culture. It's ongoing, so if you're interested, go to the insidersoutsiders.festival.org. We have an ongoing program of online events, and I really wanted to focus on that. Before I do, Aurelia, thank you so much. I just wanted to add my voice. There are many lectures which are interesting on an intellectual level, but you managed to combine a wonderfully personal and often very poignant, sort of insight into your father's life and career with a great facility for entertaining and engaging. So thank you very, very much indeed. That was wonderful. So yes, just to continue then, next week, as Barbara mentioned, we have another hybrid talk. In other words, you can attend either in person or online, given by, again, the next three, actually, the concluding three in the Kormis-related series are very personal, because next week's is on the artist and Holocaust survivor. She actually went through the worst, Naomi Blake, given by her daughter, Anita Peleg. So that's next Wednesday, isn't it? Yes. And then on the 29th, again, Wednesday, 29th of January, we're going to go entirely online. So you can get details on the events page of the Wiener Library website, but also on the Insiders Outsiders Festival What's On section. And that's going to be a talk by Dominik Fleischmann, who is the son of a Slovak-born artist, well, with an interesting, I would say more interesting story, like all of them. Arthur Fleischmann is his sculptor father's name. And then finally, the concluding event in this series, again entirely online, is by somebody who herself is a wonderful ceramic artist, Antonia Salmon, talking about her Prague-born mother, Charlotte Meyer, who many of you will not have heard of. And actually one of the delights in working with Barbara on this series is actually discovering, well, kind of bringing back into the limelight artists I did know about, like Nemon, but also discovering some names that were not familiar to you, and I suspect, to me, and I suspect also not to you. So do, if you're interested, do check all those out. And thank you again. Thank you for coming. Thanks a lot.
Yes. Yes, and just to remind you that the books are for sale at the back, and Aurelia will be moving down there now. And if you'd like to buy a catalogue from the Kormis exhibition, my colleagues are around the desk there. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for the brilliant talk.